The 41st floor of Hartwell Capital smelled like old money and fresh threats. It wasn't the kind of place that hired women like Cassidy Fenn. Not because she wasn't qualified. She had a master's in financial forensics from Northwestern and 6 years of experience untangling the kind of accounting fraud that made federal prosecutors cry with gratitude. It was because Hartwell Capital was the kind of place where the receptionist wore a size 2 and the conference rooms had mirrors on every wall, and nobody wanted to look at Cassidy Fenn in a mirror. She knew it, she'd always known it. That's what made her invisible, and invisibility, she had learned, was its own kind of superpower. She kept her head down. She wore her dark hair pulled back. She came in early and left late and did her work so quietly and so thoroughly that nobody ever had to think about her at all, which was exactly how she'd uncovered the thing that was going to burn this building to the ground. The encrypted drive sat in the inner pocket of her blazer, warm against her ribs like a second heartbeat. 3 months of work, 47 shell companies, a money trail that ran from the Hartwell pension fund through a series of offshore accounts and landed, finally, at the feet of the Castellan Group, which was not a group at all, but a name that people in certain Chicago circles spoke only when they were sure no one was listening. Cassidy had listened plenty. That was also part of her superpower. She was still staring at the spreadsheet on her screen when the elevator opened, and the room went quiet in that specific way. It always went quiet when Rowan Vale walked in. She didn't look up. She'd trained herself not to look up. Miss Fenn. She looked up. Rowan Vale was 38 years old, 6'2", and had the kind of face that made people forget what they were saying mid-sentence. He wore charcoal grey like it had been invented for him. He had a reputation that preceded him through doors he hadn't entered yet. Not as a businessman, not exactly, though he moved through the financial world like he owned the weather. The rumors were more specific than that. The rumors involved shipping containers that arrived at night, and prosecutors who retired early, and a family name that went back to somewhere in Eastern Europe, where the winters were long and the laws were suggestions. Cassidy had also read those rumors, thoroughly. Mr. Vale. She minimized her spreadsheet without looking at it. I wasn't aware you had a meeting with Hartwell today. I don't. He was looking at her the way people rarely looked at her, directly, without the flicker of recalibration that most people did when they encountered her for the first time. No glance down and then away. No polite neutralization of expression. Just, looking, I have a meeting with you. I'm not sure that's accurate. I'm a junior analyst. You're the most dangerous person in this building. He said it the way other people said the weather would be nice tomorrow. Factual. Settled. Shall we find somewhere private to confirm that? Before she could answer, the elevator opened again, and Arthur Crane stepped out. Her boss, Hartwell's head of compliance, a man who had once told her in a performance review that she had a tendency to over-document, which she had understood immediately to mean that she was finding things he didn't want found. He saw Rowan Vale first, and his face did the thing it always did around powerful men. It rearranged itself into something eager and small. Then he saw Cassidy standing next to him, and it did something else entirely. Fenn. His voice had the edge it got when she'd done something he hadn't authorized. What's going on? I was just about to ask Miss Fenn to join me for a working lunch, Rowan said pleasantly. I hope you can spare her. Arthur's smile didn't reach his eyes. Of course. Though I'd love to know the context. Leave the context to the adults, Arthur. The silence after that was total. Cassidy watched Arthur Crane absorb the sentence. She watched the color rise in his neck. She thought, with the small, quiet part of that had been absorbing slights for 31 years. Yeah. Now you know how it feels. She picked up her bag and followed Rowan Vale to the elevator without another word. They rode down in silence. The elevator was mirrored. Of course it was. And she watched his reflection watching hers and felt something she couldn't immediately name. You know what's on that drive, she said. It wasn't a question. I know what you found, he said. I'd like to know how much of it you understand. All of it, including the parts that implicate the Castellan Group. especially those parts. He was quiet for a moment. The elevator reached the lobby. He held the door with one hand and looked at her. Really looked at her. The way she was starting to understand was simply how he looked at things that mattered to him, and said, "Then you're either the smartest person I've met in a decade, or you have no idea what kind of danger you're in. Why can't it be both?" Something moved across his face. It wasn't quite a smile. It was more serious than a smile. "Both," he agreed. "Come on. We need to talk." The restaurant was Italian and expensive and so quiet that the silverware seemed apologetic for making noise. Rowan ordered water and told her to order whatever she wanted. She ordered the pasta because she was hungry, and she'd stopped performing the theater of eating salad in front of people who were already going to form opinions about her. He noticed. She could tell he noticed because he didn't, the way most people noticed, conspicuously with that brief recalibration. He just filed it away the same way she filed things away, quietly, into some internal index she suspected was very thorough. "The Castellan Group has been siphoning from the Hartwell Pension Fund for 4 years, she said, once the server had gone. 47 shells across 6 jurisdictions. The original entry point was a derivatives contract that Hartwell's CFO signed in 2021, which I'm fairly certain he didn't read carefully enough to understand what he was actually agreeing to. By the time I picked up the trail, they'd moved approximately $260 million. Rowan said nothing. "The current point of contact between Hartwell and the Castellan operation is Arthur Crane," she continued. "He receives a monthly wire from a Cayman account that belongs, on paper, to a consulting firm called Meridian Advisory Partners, which doesn't appear to have any actual clients or employees. He's been doing this for 18 months. You have documentation. I have everything. How long have you known? 3 months. Why haven't you gone to the authorities?" She folded her hands on the table. "Because I spent the first month trying to figure out if I was wrong. And the second month figuring out why Arthur kept steering me away from the Q3 reports. And the third month understanding exactly who the Castellan Group is." She paused. "I didn't think the FBI was going to be faster than the people who would come for me if I was wrong about the wrong thing." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're not wrong. I know. The Castellan Group is yours," she said, "or adjacent to yours. I haven't been able to establish the exact structure of your relationship to them, but your name appears in a 2019 consulting agreement attached to a subsidiary of a holding company that appears twice in the shell chain. You're either running them or you're their biggest client, or you found out about this the same way I did." She watched his face. "And if it was the last one, you'd already know everything I just told you, which means you're here because you have a problem and you think I can solve it." The silence stretched. Then Rowan Vail said very quietly, "Who else have you told?" "No one. Not even Hartwell's board. Especially not them. 2 of them are on the Castellan payroll." He sat back. Something had shifted in his expression, not surprise exactly. It was closer to the look of a man who had been holding a very heavy thing for a very long time and had just encountered someone else capable of holding it with him. "The Castellan Group is not mine," he said. "They've been operating inside my supply chain for 2 years without my knowledge. By the time I understood what was happening, they had enough of my infrastructure to make extraction complicated." He said it the way people described weather patterns, analytically, without self-pity. "They are also responsible for the death of my operations director, which was ruled an accident for a moment. Cassidy was quiet. I'm sorry." Milo was. He stopped, pressed his thumb to the edge of his glass. "He was the most honest person I had ever worked with. He found the same trail you found. He went to Arthur Crane." He paused. "Milo has been dead for 11 months. The thing that had been sitting at the back of Cassidy's throat for 3 months. The knowledge, the weight of it shifted into something sharper. "I need your drive," he said. "And I need you to walk me through every connection you made. All of it. In exchange, I can offer you protection, whatever resources you need, and my word that the people responsible for this will not walk free." "Your word," she repeated. "I understand that's not a conventional currency. It's not." She looked at him across the table. "What it is the only thing you actually have to offer me, because you're right that the documentation gives you leverage, but you need me to explain the documentation, and I need to believe you're not going to use it to protect yourself and disappear the rest." She paused. So, he agreed. "Tell me something true," she said. "Something that costs you something to say." He was quiet for a long moment. The restaurant murmured around them. "The Castellan Group has material on me," he said finally. "Not criminal, but complicated. They've been holding it for 2 years as insurance. If I move against them directly, they release it, and I lose things that matter to me." He met her eyes. "I am not telling you this because I think it makes me sympathetic. I'm telling you because you asked for something true, and that is the truest thing I have." Cassidy looked at him for a long moment. "Okay," she said. "I'll help you." She didn't go back to the office that afternoon. She went home to her apartment in Wicker Park, which was small and cluttered with books she'd actually read and plants she'd somehow kept alive, and she sat at her kitchen table and thought about Milo, who she'd never met, who had found the same trail and trusted the wrong person with it. She was not going to trust the wrong person. But she had done her research on Rowan Vale long before she'd found his name in the shell chain. She knew what he was, not entirely legal, not entirely criminal, operating in the space between that powerful men sometimes carved out for themselves when they had enough money and enough intelligence and enough discipline to maintain it. She knew he had built his empire from nothing, starting with a logistics company in his late 20s that had grown into something larger and less easily categorized. She knew he had a reputation for being ruthless in business and strictly controlled everywhere else, that people who worked for him stayed for years, that his enemies tended to lose in court rather than in parking garages, which she considered a meaningful distinction. She also knew, from 3 months of quietly reading everything she could find, that Milo Adair had been 34 years old and had a daughter in 2nd grade, and that Rowan Vale had been paying the child's school tuition anonymously since the funeral. She pulled out her laptop and got to work. The second meeting was at his office, which was not the kind of office most people pictured when they imagined someone like Rowan Vale. It was functional. The desk was large and the technology was expensive and the view was unobstructed, but there were no vanity pieces, no art chosen to impress. There was a whiteboard covered in notations she recognized as supply chain mapping, and a framed photograph on the credenza that she clocked immediately, a man in his mid-30s with a wide grin and a terrible tie. And didn't ask about. She set her laptop on his desk and walked him through the full architecture of what she'd built. It took 4 hours. He asked good questions. Precise, specific, the kind that told her he understood finance at a level that went beyond what most people in his position bothered to develop. He pushed back twice on her methodology and was right both times, which she acknowledged without embarrassment because being wrong didn't embarrass her. Being wrong and pretending otherwise did. By hour 3, they were standing side by side at his whiteboard, and she was drawing the shell chain with a blue marker, and he was pointing out a node she'd flagged as uncertain, and his arm was close to her shoulder, and she was aware of it, in a way that she noted and set aside because this was work, and she was good at work. "This account," he said, pointing, "Meridian Advisory. You said Arthur's been receiving wires from it for 18 months. Correct. The account opened 22 months ago." She turned. "You know when it opened 4 months before Arthur made a decision that redirected a significant portion of Hartwell's 3rd quarter reporting to a sub-team he controlled directly." He paused. "They bought him before they needed him, which means they already knew Hartwell was going to be the entry point, which means someone inside Hartwell made them an offer before the Castellan Group made Hartwell an offer." He looked at her. "You're looking for one mole. There are 2. The silence was total, she said. "The CFO," he confirmed. She turned back to the whiteboard. I need the Meridian account's full transaction history. I can have it by morning. I also need. She stopped. How are you getting this? The account records. He didn't answer for a moment. I have resources. That's not Cassidy. He said her name the way she hadn't heard her name said in a long time, not casually, not as punctuation, but with attention. Like it was a word that meant something. I need you to trust me on the mechanism. I will not ask you to do anything illegal. I will not use anything illegal in your presence, but I have ways of getting information that are unorthodox, and if you ask me to account for all of them, I'm going to have to lie to you, and I don't want to do that. She looked at him. Okay, she said. Don't lie to me. I won't. She believed him. She wasn't sure that was rational. She decided it didn't need to be rational. It needed to be calibrated, and she had been calibrating people her entire life quietly, from a position of invisibility that had taught her more about human nature than any academic credential she held. Rowan Vale was telling the truth. Not all of it, but the parts he was telling were true. She went back to the whiteboard. The threat came on a Thursday. She had been working at his office. It had become, in the space of 2 weeks, the place she worked, both because the resources were better and because she'd discovered that being in proximity to Rowan Vale was something she had stopped trying to be rational about. When her phone buzzed with an unknown number, we know what you have. We know where you live. Walk away. She photographed the message and sent it to Rowan's number, and then sat very still for a moment and breathed. He was in front of her in 4 minutes, which meant he'd been close, which meant he'd been keeping track of where she was, and she found she didn't mind that the way she probably should have. Don't go home, he said. I wasn't planning to. I have it. He stopped. Started again. I have a place. Secure. You'll have everything you need to keep working. He paused. I'll have someone go to your apartment for whatever you need. My plants. He blinked. I have 7 plants. They need to be watered every 3 days. If your person could bring them, I will personally ensure your plants are transported safely. She looked at him. Something in his expression was doing something she couldn't quite categorize. Not quite amusement, not quite tenderness. Something in between that sat in the lines around his eyes and made him look for a moment, less like a man who operated in shadows and more like a man who was slightly undone by the request. Thank you, she said. And then, we need to accelerate the timeline. Agreed. I think I can access the Meridian account's outgoing wire history through Hartwell's reconciliation system. It's not technically my authorization level, but the access credentials I use for forensic review have read permissions on archived data going back. Do it, he said. Whatever you need. She pulled her laptop toward her. Give me 2 hours. What she found in those 2 hours was not $260 million. It was $412 million. The CFO, a man named Gerald Peck who had been with Hartwell for 19 years and had a boat and a vacation home in Wisconsin, and a LinkedIn profile that described him as passionate about financial integrity, had been the original contact. He had approached the Castellan Group. He had structured the initial derivatives contract specifically to create the entry point. Arthur Crane had been recruited later as operational cover, a layer of insulation between Peck and the money. Milo Adair had found Crane. He had never found Peck. Cassidy found both. She compiled the documentation into a package that was thorough enough to make a federal prosecutor weep with gratitude. She had learned, over 6 years, exactly what weeping with gratitude looked like, and she encrypted it, and she sent it simultaneously to 3 separate locations, and a journalist she trusted more, and a federal investigator, whose name she had obtained from a source she was not going to explain to anyone. Then she walked into the room where Rowan was on the phone and waited for him to finish. He hung up. He looked at her. Something in her face told him before she said a word. How bad, he said. 412 million. Peck was the origin. He approached them. She paused. I've already filed. Everywhere. It's done. He was very still. If you had information you needed to protect, she began. It doesn't matter anymore. He said it quietly. It doesn't matter they had on me. Let them release it. It's been 2 years. I'm tired. He ran a hand across his jaw. Cassidy, she waited. Are you safe? I'm safe. It's out of my hands now. There's nothing for them to suppress. That's not what I asked. He crossed the room toward her with the same quality of attention he brought to everything. Deliberate, complete, and stopped close enough that she had to look up to see his face. Are you safe? Not the case. You, she looked at him. For 31 years she had been the person no one saw, the woman in the oversized blazer with her head down and her work done, and her entire interior life conducted in perfect silence, because nobody had ever looked at her long enough to wonder what was happening inside it. She had learned to be invisible, and she had used that invisibility, and she had told herself it was a superpower, which it was, but it was also a wound, and she was so used to the wound that she had stopped being able to feel the edges of it. Rowan Vale was looking at her like she was the only thing in the room. I'm okay, she said. You're more than okay. He said it without any inflection at all, which made it more certain than if he'd decorated it. You just broke apart a criminal enterprise that 2 federal agencies have been failing to prosecute for 6 years. You did it in 3 months, in your spare time, while Arthur Crane was calling you into his office to tell you to ease up on the documentation. He did say that. What did you say? I said yes, of course, and then I documented more thoroughly. The thing that moved across his face that wasn't quite a smile became, this time, something closer to a smile. I want to ask you something, he said, and I need you to tell me if it's inappropriate, because I'm aware the last 3 weeks have been circumstances that may not constitute a normal context for Rowan. He stopped. Ask, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Just dinner. She looked at him. The room was quiet. Somewhere outside, the city was doing what Chicago always did in October, turning the wind into something that felt personal. Yes, she said. But I'm picking the restaurant. Gerald Peck was arrested on a Tuesday morning at his boat, which Cassidy had always found poetically appropriate. Arthur Crane was arrested the same afternoon at the Hartwell offices, which meant the entire floor got to watch, which she had not engineered but did not mourn. 3 senior members of the Castellan group were indicted within the week. 2 others began cooperating with federal investigators in exchange for considerations that were not her business and not her problem. The material the Castellan group had been holding over Rowan, a set of communications from 2020 involving a regulatory grey area that had since been resolved, was released to 2 tabloids, which ran it for 48 hours and then moved on to other things, because it was, in the end, not particularly scandalous. And because Rowan had gotten ahead of it with a statement from his legal team that was so aggressively boring and procedurally correct that there was nothing for anyone to grab onto. She read the statement and recognized his hand in it, even though his lawyers had written it, because it had the same quality his thinking always had: precise, patient, unconcerned with appearances, and entirely focused on outcome. She texted him, "Your lawyers write like you think." He texted back, "I'll take that as a compliment. It is one," she wrote, and then, "How are you doing?" He called her instead of texting back, which she was learning meant the answer was complicated. "I'm okay," he said when she picked up. His voice was lower than usual. "Tired. It's been a long 2 years, I know. I keep thinking about Milo. I know. He would have liked you." A pause. He liked people who did things quietly and correctly and didn't need credit for it. "Did you like people like that before me?" A silence, then, "I didn't meet people like that. I don't think I was looking in the right places." Another pause. "You are not what I expected to find in the Hartwell building, Cassidy. What were you expecting to find? Someone who'd take my offer and run. Someone I'd have to manage. Someone who needed to be explained things." His voice was even, but there was something underneath the evenness that she was learning to hear. "Someone I could keep at a distance." And instead, he said, "You explained things to me, and then you moved faster than I did, and then you made a decision that took the whole thing out of my hands, which nobody has done since Milo, and it felt. He stopped. It felt like being able to put something down. She was quiet for a moment. "The restaurant I picked," she said. "Friday. 7 o'clock. It's not fancy. I don't need fancy. I know you don't." She had learned this about him in 3 weeks of watching him, that the expensive things in his life were functional, chosen for quality rather than display, and that the things that actually mattered to him were not expensive at all. The photograph on the credenza, the plant she'd seen on the windowsill of the secure house, which had clearly been there for years. The way he'd made sure every single day of the past 3 weeks that her own plants had been watered. "What kind of restaurant?" he asked. "The kind where the portions are generous and the noise level is human, and nobody's going to care what we look like." A pause. "I'll be there at 7, he said. The night before the dinner, she stood in front of her mirror, her real mirror, in her own apartment, which she'd returned to once the arrests had been processed, and looked at herself for a long moment. She was 31 years old, she was 5'4", and soft in all the places that the world had spent considerable energy informing her were problems. She had dark eyes that missed very little and a mind that had untangled $412 million of criminal fraud in her spare time, and she had spent the last 3 weeks working closer to a man who unsettled her than she had ever allowed anyone to be. She was not going to perform anything tomorrow night. She was not going to be smaller or quieter or more carefully arranged than she was. She had learned somewhere in the last 3 weeks, maybe in the elevator, maybe at the whiteboard, maybe in the moment he'd asked, "Are you safe?" and meant you, specifically you, that Rowan Vale was paying attention, and what he was paying attention to was her, not the version of her that fit neatly somewhere, her. She put on the dress she liked and went to bed. The restaurant was a Brazilian place in Pilsen that her friend Diane had taken her to 3 years ago, and that she'd been returning to ever since. It was loud in a warm way, with wooden tables and candles in glass jars and servers who moved fast and talked faster. Rowan was already there when she arrived. He was wearing dark jeans and a dark jacket, and he was out of place in the best possible way, the kind of man who carried his own atmosphere with him. And when she walked in, he looked up from the menu, and something in his face did the thing she'd been watching it do for 3 weeks. That settling, that specific kind of attention that she was starting to understand was simply how he looked at her. He stood when she reached the table. "You look." He stopped. "Started again, you look like yourself." She sat down across from him. "Is that good?" "It's the best thing I know how to say about a person." The server came. They ordered too much food. She ordered what she wanted. He ordered more than he'd probably eat, and at some point during the second course, she realized they'd been talking for an hour, and she couldn't have said what about, only that it had moved the way good conversations moved, from one real thing to another, without any of the usual performance that people did when they were trying to seem worth talking to. She didn't try to seem worth talking to, she just talked. He listened the way he did everything, completely, with that quality of attention that felt like being taken seriously, which she had wanted her whole life without ever quite admitting it. "You know what I keep thinking about," she said at some point over dessert. "Tell me," Arthur Crane told me 8 months ago, that I had a tendency to over-document. She picked up her fork. "I have been thinking about that sentence for 8 months. And now, Gerald Peck is in federal custody, and Arthur Crane cried on camera outside the Hartwell building, and somewhere there are 267 boxes of documentation with my name on them." She paused. "I feel fine about the over-documenting." He looked at her across the table in the candlelight with that expression that she had finally found a word for, somewhere around the 2nd week, reverent. Like she was something he had not expected to exist, and was adjusting his understanding of the world to accommodate. "I'm going to need someone," he said, "long-term, for compliance oversight, for building systems that make what Castellan did structurally impossible." He paused. "I realize I'm offering you a job at dinner, which is probably—" "Yes," she said. "You don't want to hear the terms. I want to hear the terms. But yes, the answer is yes. She met his eyes. You should know that I don't under-document. I'm counting on it. She smiled. He reached across the table, not dramatically, not with hand over hers. Just that. His hand over hers on the wooden table in the warm, loud room, and she felt it all the way up to her collarbone, this simple thing, this being seen. I looked for you for 2 years, he said quietly. I didn't know I was looking, but I was. She turned her hand over under his. I've been here, she said. I'm not that hard to find if you know how to look. Outside, Chicago was doing what it did, big and cold and indifferent to individual stories, full of light. Inside, the candles burned down low, and the food was generous, and the noise was human, and nobody cared what they looked like, and Cassidy Fenn, who had spent 31 years being invisible, sat in the warm middle of it all, and let herself be completely, unhurriedly seen.